work on this particular product. Hold on, okay, am I sharing hold on, that's the wrong one.
I can see MBTA Service Delivery Policy 2024 updates.
Yes, it is. Unfortunately, the online version and not the one that has in presentation mode. So is it now in presentation mode for folks? Can everybody see the big blown up version? Wonderful.
Yep,
Thank you.
sure can.
Okay, so this is a policy that is coming out of our policy team. Unfortunately, we had some overlapping absences this evening, and so members of our policy team were not able to join us for this particular conversation. But if we have any particular pieces of feedback, we can bring it back to them. So Rachel Morse in particular worked pretty hard on these policy updates, and she is on Lindsay Heffernan's team, just so folks are aware of the other kind of players who contributed to this work. So I'm going to run you through what the updates are for this policy. So as a reminder, the service delivery policy is our policy that sets the service quality standards and then defines how service delivery is measured against those standards. Importantly, this is not proposing any service changes. We are not proposing any service changes with this document. This is just about what we say we will deliver and how we measure ourselves against what we say we will deliver. So it could get a little wonky if we want to talk about kind of what the specifics are of how we're updating the metrics and the calculations. I'm happy to go deep on some of those conversations, but what I've prepared for us to talk about tonight is just kind of the high level, the conceptual, like what are we adjusting and changing with this update. So the service objectives are broadly concerned with the quality and the quantity of the service provided. So the service objectives include service availability, the accessibility of our service, the reliability of our service, and then comfort and crowding. We have also some paratransit standards that are included in this document as well. Our department, OPMI, produces an annual public-facing report evaluating our service quality performance against these standards every year, and we release it generally in the fall. So we would release the 2024 annual report after the updates to the service delivery policy go into effect and after the closing of the fall rating. So the last time this policy was updated was in 2021. This revision includes some minor and moderate changes in both the way that the document itself is structured and then some of the content in the document as well. Any questions about what the service delivery policy is before I start talking a little bit about the timeline and next steps? Just so you have a grounding. No. Great. Okay. So here's the process that we're going through. We previewed some of these changes for the transit advocates back in October. We walked them through a version of this presentation that contained a lot more detail so that they could kind of see and weigh in on some of the metrics changes and the standards and figure out kind of if we were going to get any major feedback about any of the pieces that we were proposing. We previewed some of the policy changes in a very similar presentation to this in the October board meeting. I am briefing you right now for the MBTA advisory board, and we are required by statute to brief the advisory board. So that is also why we are here. We have a public hearing on the proposed changes scheduled for tomorrow. So if you didn't get enough of this presentation, you are welcome to come tomorrow and participate again. And then we'll begin the 21-day public comment period, which will be open through December 5th. At that point, we will bring this back to the board for a final vote to adopt the changes to the service delivery policy. So we are midstream on this process and actively soliciting feedback on the proposed changes. Okay, what are those proposed changes? So the substantive changes fall under the 4 service objectives that I outlined at the start. So first, let's start with the reliability. This is the biggest change that we are making in this policy update. We are changing how we analyze heavy rail reliability. So if you have ever gone to mbta.com and looked at our performance metrics and looked at the reliability section of our performance metrics, you will have seen a metric there called on-time performance. Traditionally, people were not a big fan of this metric. It's tied to our schedule. So when we changed our schedule and reduced the amount of service we were providing, we still said that metric still said we were doing okay because we were only measuring ourselves against the service that we had scheduled, right? So this shift will move us from on-time performance to something we are calling excess trip time, where there is a baseline trip time that we assume it takes for people to travel from one point to another in our system. And then we measure how long it took. And then we figure out kind of how many minutes of excess trip time did passengers experience on their day-to-day trip. So any trips that experience more than 5 minutes of excess trip time are trips that are not a good passenger experience. So we're saying that those trips are kind of failing our new excess trip time metric. And this kind of is much, much more reflective of the passenger experience. And it's much, much kind of better weighted for the volumes of passengers that we experience too. So that is the biggest substantive change that is coming in this update for the service delivery policy. Some of the other changes include a change to the calculation for bus reliability. This is a metric where we had not previously had a way to include drop trips in the calculation we were doing. So we were giving ourselves a little bit too much credit here, where they were just kind of removed from the denominator when we were looking at those. And so now we are incorporating that into our calculation because we worked pretty hard at improving the data quality there to make sure we could get this incorporated. So that is also very exciting. There's a small tweak to some of the green line trunk headways in the reliability calculation there too. That one, again, is like very deep in the weeds in terms of what the actual substantive calculation change is. But we can talk a little bit about what that looks like if folks are interested. The second category for service objectives that we have some changes that we're making is under accessibility. And again, these are changes that have been a long time coming that we are very excited about. And we worked very closely with Laura and her team on making some of these adjustments to this policy, which includes new standards for bus stop accessibility and ferry accessibility. Ferry accessibility is particularly interesting because it's kind of like a two-part equation. A boat can be accessible and a dock can be accessible. And so if you have an accessible boat parking at an inaccessible dock, that trip is inaccessible. So we are just kind of doing a little bit more mapping of what that looks like and then kind of the proportion of our ferry riders that are experiencing accessible trips, which it would be a combination of all accessible docks and an accessible boat as well. We are also making adjustments to how we calculate some of our elevator closures to eliminate some of the exceptions that we'd had previously. And we are counting more of the closures as making the platform inaccessible. So the way the service delivery policy measures the accessibility of platforms is kind of, can you get to a service platform to access service? And historically, we had calculated this in a way where if we provided a shuttling service from an accessible platform to an inaccessible stop, we counted that as an accessible piece of service. But because it's really like a seat, there's a change in what vehicle you're in, you have to kind of navigate that whole portion of the system. We decided to adjust that so that that no longer counts as an accessible trip. So those are the major changes that are coming in reliability and accessibility. The following changes in these next two areas are quite, relatively minor compared to the other changes that I just walked through. So in terms of service availability, we are streamlining the minimum frequency standard for our frequent bus routes, which were formerly known as key bus routes. These will just be every 15 minutes as a standard all day, every day. There were previous standards that were different at different times of day, different for weekends, Saturdays as compared to Sundays. This will just kind of help streamline the expectation of if it's a frequent bus route, it's every 15 minutes every day, at all times of day, peak and off peak. We are also refining the span of service definition. So this one is just an adjustment that we're making to be a little bit more consistent with how other transit agencies measure their span of service. So places like WMATA do this. So it's just changing it from the inside bounds to the outside bounds of the schedule. So we measure it based on when the trips leave their origin and arrive at their destination rather than measuring from the morning when they arrive at their destination and when they leave the origin in the evening. And then finally, we have also worked really hard on some of the data availability in order to be able to calculate comfort and crowding on our heavy rail vehicles. So we are now uh, able to approximate crowding on our heavy rail vehicles to start to measure kind of the number of trips that people are taking or the amount of time that people are spending in crowded conditions on heavy rail vehicles. So I know I ran through a lot of content. There's this can all be summarized in this kind of table. I have more detailed information and individual like infographics about each of these things if we would like to dive into any one of the pieces that I talked about here. But I do understand that this is kind of a dense policy. Usually, when we're talking about some of our policies, we aren't necessarily talking about calculations. And so I recognize that this may not be diving into the math might not be everybody's top priority.
Thank you. So Matt Moran, who is the chair of this committee, was here a second ago. I think Matt's still here. Matt, do you want to take the gavel or do you want me to do it? Well, I'll do it until Matt pops back over.
Okay.
Steve, I see your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so on the heavy rail reliability,
Mhm.
so if a train leaves 20 minutes late and arrives 20 minutes uh, late in its destination, then you're saying there's no excess time, so that train's okay?
No, that train would not be okay.
So how would that
So
work?
yeah. So, okay, let's talk about what we currently have and I'll show you what we currently have and let's talk about what we're moving to. So, what we currently have is a metric called on-time performance. This was available on MBTA.com on the performance pages. And what I've got highlighted over here is a visual of what the red, orange, and blue lines performance on this metric was from December of 2021 through July of 2024. Now, everyone on this call knows that we did not deliver 80% reliability on the red line in that time period, right? Like no person who is a red line user would say that they experienced 80% reliability for their trips, right? So this metric just wasn't reflecting the reality. And it's again because it was tied to the schedule itself. So it just reflected whatever we had scheduled. So what we are moving to is called this excess trip time. So I am measuring the actual wait time for people, so how long they waited on the platform. I am measuring the actual travel time for people, and then I'm combining those, and that's the actual trip time. I'm comparing that actual trip time to a benchmark trip time. Anything that goes over the benchmark trip time is considered excess, right? So if it's exceeded that benchmark trip time by 20 minutes, it's 20 minutes of excess trip time, right? So what that means is then what we're measuring this against, and when we're looking at it for using like the threshold of 5 minutes. So we're saying if we get you to your destination within 5 minutes of when we think it should take us to get there, that trip is okay, right? But if it's taking more than 5 minutes, that trip is not okay. So if we look at the red line performance on this one and we compare the old on-time performance metric, which is available up at the top here, to what the performance looks like on our new excess trip time metric, this is much more reflective of what passengers on the red line experienced over the course of the last 2 years, right? There was a low here in the spring of 2023 where 18% of our trips were within the 5 minute threshold on the red line. We really were struggling to deliver service. And so I think this is just something that hopefully will be a little bit, feel a little bit more honest in terms of how we talk about what we're delivering and what we promise.
So the way that you currently do it, the problem is you measure, the final stop, as whether that gets there in time or not. So that doesn't pick up people who had to wait for a long time in between and got off and didn't get off at the last stop. So as long as, if the train catches up at the end and gets to that last stop, okay, it's rated on time. So how does this new method
So this
catch
does not talk
individual
about the
passengers?
terminus at all, right? So it doesn't have anything to do with the last stop. What we actually do is we have each segment on the red line, for example, right? So let's say you're going from Alewife to Park Street, or you could be going from Davis to Broadway, right? Like, or you could be on one of the branches. We can infer where people are on our system. We know that information. And I know that based on like when people tap into the system. And so I'm using actual travel origins and destinations of people on the system. It has nothing to do with the ends of the line, the terminus. So it's about what path you actually traveled on the system. And it does not have to do with whether or not the train is reaching the destination within a certain period of time, right? The way what is calculated like that is commuter rail, but we are only talking about our heavy rail lines here. So this is just red, orange, and blue.
Oh, will this happen for the rail lines?
We are going to be working on expanding it to the green line and then also bus. But underpinning all of these changes were years of data work, right? So one of the reasons we could not change the on-time performance metric prior to this was we were tied to a legacy performance data system. We did about a year and a half, almost 2 years of work to migrate over that system. And make sure that we upgraded the infrastructure itself, but then also like some of the pieces of information that come in with some of that data. So that enabled us to make this change for the heavy rail lines. We're still working on parsing some of the data for Green Line. Green Line is obviously a little bit more complicated than the rail lines are, the heavy rail lines are. So we are going to be hopefully moving to Green Line next and then hoping to round this out with bus. But we can't do it all at once, so we're starting here.
So
And then
eventually will it be done for the rail?
for commuter rail
So
or,
Heavy rail.
Steve, this is rapid transit. This is not commuter rail. I'm
Oh,
sorry. We're
okay.
not talking about commuter rail at this point,
Wrong
okay?
meeting. All right.
Thank
Okay,
you.
I'll give you
Len,
that.
go ahead, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So you actually answered some of my questions.
okay,
But so you said you're going to be extending this to especially I'm talking the extended trip time to buses, right? At some point.
mm-hmm.
Okay, that's
Yes.
great. And and just curious, what was the data gap? And I ask about this because I have long since, along with power, feeling that the team needs to spend more money on power, feeling that we need to spend more money on IT type work, because the amount of money you spend is very small. And I'm wondering, what was the data gap and how were we able to fill it?
Sure. I can talk a little bit about that project. So it was called the LAMP project, the Lightweight Application for Managing Performance, is where we are now storing our performance data. Functionally, what it does is it takes any movement data from our signal system and starts parsing that information into event data. So like this train has left this stop. This train is moving into this signal, et cetera, et cetera. Other people who use this data, because we do make it publicly available, include Transit Matters, right? So they had used this data source to help make all of their public facing dashboards that measured our performance as well. So we upgraded the underlying system to make it a little bit more reliable, which meant that we could do additional calculations on top of it. The way the old system functioned, we couldn't really make many changes to the ways the calculation worked within that system, both because of the age of the contract and the age of the infrastructure on which it was stored with a vendor. So we transitioned that to an in-house storage that is now managed by our own TID department. And we are in the process again of ingesting additional data in there, including Green Line and bus.
This is great. I love knowing that you're doing it in-house too, because I think it's important to develop the expertise in-house because you can probably apply, what you learn to other things, whether they are related to these kind of metrics or something else. And one last quick question.
Sure.
So the service availability is going to apply to the frequent bus routes. What about the non-frequent bus routes, the other non-key bus routes?
I don't think we're making any changes
Okay.
to the the local bus routes. So again, we are just making some changes to the frequency definition.
Right, right. But in terms of measuring, because you're measuring availability, right? And so maybe this is just the wrong question.
It's okay.
Sometimes, yeah.
So
Okay.
frequency has to do with measuring what we schedule, right? So
Right.
it does not have to do with what we deliver. It has to do
Right.
with measuring what we are going to schedule and put out publicly as our schedule, right? So this says that we now are going to attempt to measure ourselves and see if we're scheduling better service on these frequent routes such that we're going to every 15 minutes every day, rather than these very different kind of time periods throughout different kinds of days. And so for a local bus, we're not changing anything necessarily for any of the metrics that are in there. We're hoping again to longer term change how we measure reliability for bus, which is about what we deliver.
Right.
But frequency is about what we schedule, not what we deliver.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. It's
Okay.
great though. I'm very pleased with what you all doing. This is great. Thank you.
Here, go ahead, Andy.
I did not have a chance to type in who I am, so I'm just going to say, because it's not in there, I'm Andy Reeker. I'm at the City of Cambridge. I'm the Transit Program Manager here. Kind of following up on Len's comment, I think one of the things that we've heard in the kind of realm of bus network redesign is, I think, a lot of appreciation for the frequent bus routes. So it's nice to see that this is being reflected in the service frequency and the kind of provision of service. Kind of picking up a little bit on the thread that Len was talking about, though, I think one of the things that came across, at least in our conversations about the bus network redesign changes, is that folks have processed the bus network redesign changes as a whole, right? So not just the subset of frequent bus routes. And so kind of like Len, I'm a little bit concerned or confused about kind of changing only the frequent bus route definition at this time, and not also considering making the changes that are included in the bus network redesign, local routes which have 30 minutes all days, longer spans of service, and also coverage routes, which I don't think the definition would change like quite a bit versus what's in the service delivery policy. But I was wondering if you could speak to why it's only the frequent bus routes and not the local bus routes, because I think that's going to be a point of concern in the future. And I think just wanted to get an understanding of what the thought process was behind that.
Yeah, I would have to double check with our policy team because I think that decision originated in that team. I do think that the service delivery policy was mostly consistent with the promises of the bus network redesign for local bus,
No,
but
it's 30 minutes all day, and it says 60 in middays today,
okay.
as
I would have to
proposed.
check again with our policy team in terms of exactly what the thinking was there, but I can take that back to them.
Yeah, no, I think that would be good because I think that's probably the biggest concern. Like folks see the promise of the map and they're happy to see frequent service, but kind of the promise, right? The kind of social contract here is that the T would also invest in non-frequent service as well too, and seeing increases there. So I'm a little concerned that, you know, I think on a policy perspective, at the very least, that both things aren't being done at the same time, just
Okay.
given the feedback that we've heard.
Yeah. All right. That's good to know. Thank you.
Matt, I see you are back on camera. Do you want to take the chair?
Thanks, Brian, for recognizing me. I'm more than happy to let you continue moderating. You're doing a fantastic job, so I appreciate it, and sorry for going off camera, but I'll wait my turn to ask my question.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Happy to do it. Few people call me moderate, but I appreciate that, Matt. Thank you. Jay, I think you're up next.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, Jen, I think this is fantastic. This metric you go into now, I think that's a really great, much better, much improved way to measure the passenger experience. So I'm really happy to see this. One quick question I just had was you mentioned this benchmark that you're measuring against a benchmark trip time, and I'm just curious what that is, how you developed it. Maybe I missed it.
Nope.
Oh, okay.
No, you didn't miss it.
Okay.
I hadn't talked about it yet.
Okay, then I'll wait then.
No, I hadn't planned on talking about it unless someone asked about it. Again, this policy is different people engage with it very differently, right? Like some people are not as interested in kind of hearing all the nitty-gritty pieces of it, and some people are, and I'm thrilled that you are. So let's talk about it.
Well, I think you start to answer my question, which is it's the fastest observed travel time
Correct.
From any month since 2021. And I would actually say that maybe in a few months with the slow zones all being lifted
Correct.
across the system, you're going to have
And
a
this is
very high
why
benchmark.
this is why we went with this,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So we debated internally, right? Like we talked about potentially just using like 2019 schedules, but then there were, you know, still challenges in 2019 that were not reflective of kind of what we wanted to set as the benchmark. So
Mm.
what we did was we've observed the fastest travel time among every single segment, and that's a smaller segment than you can travel, right? Like that's like a signal segment.
Right.
And so combined it into a composite perfect day and are comparing whether or not we get to that within 5 minutes for every trip that passengers take on our system.
So will it be a benchmark that will change over time, or
Great question. So for now, we're going to roll it out with a consistent benchmark with the benchmarks set pretty close to the time of release. I think longer term, we'd be looking to potentially have it be a more regularly updated benchmark, but that's not something that I think, again, when we're trying to focus on rolling out the new metric, I think I'd prefer to focus on then Green Line and Bus, and then focus on having it be like a continuous improvement kind of
Right.
benchmark. But if there's a different preference for this group, then I would love to hear that, because I think that's important feedback to kind of take into account. But
no, I think
that's
as long as
kind
you're
of
picking
how
a period of time where you got good service, right? In
yeah.
2021, arguably, maybe it did, maybe it didn't, depending on where you were in the system. But
We had fewer passengers on the system, so
Mm.
our dwell times were much lower,
Mm.
right? So like where we lost some of the time on some of the signals for the slow zones is like headed into stations, we kind of made it up by having really low passengers on the
Yeah.
system with the dwell times. But again, a lot of these the benchmark pieces are with the vast majority of this track improvement plan completed, right? So the segment times do come from the clearing of most of those speed restrictions, some of which obviously were still in place in 2019.
Right. Right.
So
Oh, great. No, again, I think this is great. Happy to see you moving in this direction, and I'll throw Steve a shout out. I think, when the time comes to put this on the commuter rail end of things, it'll be great too. But great work.
Susan, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thanks for this. So I will admit that I have not read the service delivery policy, so I am right now scanning it very quickly, your update. So I have a couple questions for you related to bus metrics.
Mhm.
So regarding scheduled times, if the T were to reduce their scheduled service, do you have a metric that tracks that? So say you had a bus that was scheduled for every 30 minutes and then you change it to be every 40, 45, or just something less. Do you have a metric that tracks that? And similarly, a metric that tracks when you've reduced or somehow changed coverage?
So those are metrics that are contained in the service delivery policy, right? So
Okay.
the service delivery policy measures what we have scheduled. Anytime coverage has changed, again, with the bus network redesign, I think, and the opening of like GLX, those are some of the recent examples of, where we've seen coverage changes recently. But I think for the most part, generally speaking, from rating to rating, without these like big efforts that are opening or debuting, we don't see many changes in like coverage.
So just as an example, so a lot of people lost some service during COVID, some of which has come back, some of which hasn't. We'd be able to go back and track metrics that actually show that.
Yes, you
Okay.
can look at, sorry, I'm trying to see if I have it I don't have it with me in this deck, but you can actually go back online to the service delivery policy page. And at the bottom of that page, there's a link to the 3 different reports that are already available. So there's the 2021 service delivery policy report, 22 and 23. Those are against the 2021 service delivery policy metrics, right? So they will not reflect the changes that we're talking about here in terms of calculations for reliability in particular. So that means for like bus trips, for example, it will not include drop trips in that reliability metric. It will not be the new excess trip time metric. It will be the old on-time performance metric, but you will see the kind of what the calculations and results were for the scheduled service, which includes frequency and includes the coverage information as well.
Thanks. And then another question, just again, from this quick scan I'm doing of the service delivery policy, I noticed that you have bus route benefit cost ratio. And with three weighted components, ridership at 70%, reduced fare users at 15%, and access to the network at 15%. I'm curious if you factor into those ridership calculations when a bus route is like a lower frequency bus, because generally you're going to get higher ridership in
Right.
different settings. There's different reasons you get higher ridership. So I'm just wondering if that gets factored in at all.
So we have been kind of moving away from the bus triangles as a metric for measuring some of the bus routes. And it's because of some of these factors that you're highlighting, right? So instead, we were focusing for the last several years on a lot of the metrics that went along with the bus network redesign, rather than that kind of the triangle, the ratio. And instead focused a little bit more on things like competitiveness, access to destinations, those kinds of things.
Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. Matt, I think you're up.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. And congrats, Jen and the rest of your team on putting this together. Really appreciate it. And, I think there's a lot for us to like here. I think there's a lot to be excited about. So I just want to say kudos to you guys for putting together a document that is, I think, transformative in a lot of ways, and also will give us a good path forward. Two specific questions or thoughts. First, I would tend to concur with Len and Andy around sort of the less frequent bus routes and how those get analyzed. And I guess once we have some more definition, I guess, would you be willing to come back to this group or come back to the municipalities and sort of talk a little bit more about how that's going to be assessed?
For the changes in the reliability metric?
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
absolutely. Yeah. Happy to come back and talk to anybody about that once I figure out how to calculate it.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Like,
of course.
so I mean, we are for event horizon for this is not like next month, right? Like, and so I think realistically, I'm hoping to have something functioning internally for Greenland sometime next year, but even that might be a little too ambitious, just given kind of some of the challenges that present themselves with the Greenland data, frankly. And ridership data on the Green Line being primarily the biggest challenge there, right? So being able to kind of say like definitively like who actually rode some of these segments and like where are they getting off
Yeah.
is kind of challenging. So we'll work through that first, I think, and then kind of spread out into bus. So realistically, I mean, we might be, if I'm being optimistic, like end of next year, like a year from now, coming back about bus, maybe. But that feels aggressive even. So it would be a while, but absolutely, yes, we would be doing the same kind of process for all of this. And happy to kind of come back a little bit farther in advance of the actual policy update to talk to this group about getting feedback on the actual calculation as well.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you. And then
Mhm.
my second question is around the new guidelines around bus stop accessibility.
Yeah.
I guess, were there none before?
Let
And
me find the slides.
yeah,
Sorry.
no worries. I
Okay.
apologize. I had to drop off for for a few minutes in the middle. So if I missed this, I apologize. But were there none before? And I guess like sort of what was the framework under
We
which you guys
couldn't measure
developed
it
this?
before.
Okay. Gotcha.
Right? Like there was no way, I mean, just given the sheer number of bus stops in the network and then what it would take for a data collection to be able to actually understand on a regular basis how many of these are accessible, right? Because some of those things can change over time, right? And we don't own all of them. So it's like just such a nuanced and hard problem that we weren't able to really to measure it. And so what changed is that there's an ongoing project to do an audit of all the bus stops anyway. And then there's the PADI accessibility pieces of all of that. So we were leveraging all that data and we'll hope to leverage that data kind of moving forward to be able to measure this in a more ongoing basis. It's still going to be quite a lift. And I think that it won't be like every bus stop gets updated every year, but we are at least going to start looking at it to the best of our ability. So that's what changed.
Gotcha. Okay. No, that's helpful context, and that's good to know. So thank you.
Mhm.
David Kozis, please.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, John. Sorry, I missed part of the presentation, so I'm sorry if I misunderstood something, but I have just like one specific question. So let's say that there's a key bus route that has 15-minute headway,
Mhm.
and then it's divided into two routes so that you have a shorter sort of main branch that's still 15 minutes, and then a longer branch that's now maybe 20 or 25 minutes. So how would that be handled in terms of measuring the performance? Would it be, do you think it would be two different bus routes now, or just would only the 15-minute portion of the route be measured? So yeah.
Yeah, again, the measure we're talking about updating here is only as it pertains to the schedule, right? So the scheduled service for the headways for that frequent bus route. So in that hypothetical example where you're splitting the frequent bus route and it's in a corridor and we're talking about buses every 15 minutes, I do believe, Melissa, keep me honest here, most of the things that we are scheduling for the bus network redesign would still maintain that 15-minute headway with each of those new key bus routes so that the trunk should experience better service than every 15 minutes, right, Melissa? Is that not the case for
It's
some of
complicated.
them?
The actual calculation, I think, is doing a weighted average by stop, and it's weighting it by the ridership. Because hypothetically, if we had a route, let's call it the 57 and 57A, where beyond Oak Square during rush hour, there might be a 2-hour period where there's 16-minute headways, and then the rest of the route had 8-minute headways. It would measure compliance to say, okay, the number of riders at the Newton Corner and Watertown Yard to Oak Square stops would have non-compliant headways, and it would get weighted by that number of riders who are at those stops. And then the inner portion would have something closer to like 8 or 10 minutes and would get weighted by the number of those. And then you end up with like a blended number that reports of it's not going to be 100 and it's not going to be 0, but it'll be somewhere in the middle to say of how compliant is it with the standard.
Okay, I guess I sort of understood that, but thanks, Melissa, for picking
Sorry,
up
it's
what
a
I was
really
talking about.
weedsy calculation.
It's like this is kind of the perpetual struggle here, right? Like it because the schedules and what you're putting your finger on is the schedules are complicated, right? Like they're nuanced. This is not necessarily something where we can like say definitively one way or the other. So I think for most of the calculations, we try to reflect that these things are kind of scheduled within the real world in a not perfectly grid-based city in the New England area. But we're not able to perfectly account for all of that. And then when we try, it makes it more complicated to explain. So, push pull.
Alan, go ahead, please.
Thank you for your presentation. It looks like some valuable expansion of the past service policies. But I want a couple of questions. What's the application? What are you going to do with whatever your findings are when you apply all these standards? And two, what seems to be missing is measures of effectiveness, of performance standards, and things like how many passengers per revenue hour you're carrying. Is there a minimum that you want to have? And then, what do you do if you're below that minimum? And maybe the application, you're facing some serious budget problems next year. How is this going to be helpful and possibly trimming your service levels, particularly on a frequent route that you're saying minimum headways at all times of the day of 15 minutes, when there's only very light loads through a Sunday morning, for instance? I mean, how is all that going to come together, and how are you going to report it, and how are you going to use it?
So it is well beyond the scope of my role to help answer questions about how the MBTA is going to be budgeting in the fiscal crisis. So I will do my best to address
what's the purpose of the, if you
Great.
got to be able to use it, you got to issue some kind of report periodically to the public to say
we do.
how well you're doing.
Yeah, so we issue this annually to measure ourselves against this particular report. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these metrics that we're showing in terms of the performance about the service, like how well did we do at delivering the service from the rider's perspective, do appear in daily, weekly, and monthly reports to our operations team, right? So our operations team is able to see the performance of the system reflected back at them based on some of these metrics. the metrics haven't always historically been useful for them, right? This on-time performance one in particular is a great example of one that really didn't give them good information to work with. But some of these other metrics are designed to help them be a little bit more reflective about what the passengers are experiencing riding the system. Again, we do calculate annually how we're doing against the scheduled metrics. So then our service planning team, represented here by Melissa, can see how we're doing on our schedules based on our policies. I don't have an answer for you about kind of how that's going to tie back into funding crises. But I will say when the pandemic hit and we were faced with kind of very tough questions about when and where to provide service or when and where to cut service, they did refer back to the service delivery policy as a framing document for kind of what was a minimum viable product based on what we had minimally promised in our policy.
So I'll pass my greetings on to Melissa. We have a long history together. But again, I guess my interest is how is this really going to be used to make decisions on schedules and then the budget of what you can afford to run or want to run any one year. I mean, it's going to have a real world application. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay,
Well,
I
just
can
to
take that
follow,
note back.
Jen, let me just follow up on that and sort of echo what Alan is saying. And I think want to encourage you and everyone at the authority to push the management part of this forward significantly more than just the reporting portion of it, right? And I know it's really difficult, but if there was ever a way to get this information or proxies for this information to the OCC or to the bus OCC or to the folks at Cobble Hill in real time, I mean, I experience uneven headways on the green line pretty much every time I come in. 11 minutes and then 6 minutes today, for instance. The public is demanding more of the MBTA than ever before at a time when its resources are in jeopardy. And so whatever we can do to turn this information into something that's usable in real time, as opposed to just reporting what happened yesterday, because
Yep.
what happened yesterday, I can't get my time back.
So the policy is designed to reflect the rider experience, and so therefore is designed to be public facing. There are separate metrics that we already have that are close to real time that are provided for a lot of our internal audiences. Those ones are not ridership weighted because a lot of the things that happen on our system, I mean, like frankly, with our tap date information, we can't apply that in real time right now, not with the Scheiten-Bachmann system. And certainly, maybe we'll be talking about something different in a year or two from now once Cubic is fully rolled out on the system. But for now, it is what it is. And so the internal metrics are different from what is provided in the service delivery policy. We do have those, and those folks do have access to some of this information.
I mean, long before, and I'll let you know, Melissa can tell you my history, but I retired from the T and doing a lot of this work long before you had all the technology that you have today. So we didn't have the data sources readily available to nowhere near the degree that you have today.
We didn't
But-
even have some of these even as of last year or a year and a half ago,
right,
right?
well,
Like
I'm
this is
talking about-
reflective of a lot of recent work.
I know, and you're doing great work. And when I was there, we talked about, it was when the new fare boxes were coming in and the new fare gates were coming in and what kind of data. We were just, it was just discussion at that time. And I'm glad to see that it's advanced quite a bit. And as you say, it takes time and it will take more time to even get more out of it. And that's all great. But it sounds like you're talking about an annual report to the public, basically saying, oh, we did good or we didn't do so good. But as far as the operating people, they know every day what their operating performance is. I'm not sure.
Yeah, but they don't seem to do anything with that information, Alan, is my
Well,
point.
that's something else.
Well,
Yeah, they should do something, but it's
okay.
something, like you said, it's management at all levels, got to be tuned into what's happening every day out in the rails you're talking about, but even in the frequent bus routes, and what kind of actions can you do? It'll often, it will take some money to make some changes, whether it's
I know.
making sure the equipment's maintained so it's reliable. So my concern is this has got to be more than just an annual report. I mean, back a long time ago, what we used to do is do a customer satisfaction survey.
We do
And
have
every
that
year
too.
we presented a number that said, oh, 92% of our customers are satisfied, 88 were satisfied. But I mean, you need to have a real world application and basically the data that you're getting, I'm hoping, is providing input for every quarter as you make adjustments to the schedules. I'm sure it is.
So I am going to bring up really quickly, and I should have stopped sharing my screen, right? Can folks see my screen, or yes, no, maybe?
We can see it.
Oh, you can still see it. Great. All right, then I'm going to change it. Can folks see this screen? MBTA.com/performance metrics. Yes? Great. So this is where some of the service delivery policy metrics live on our website, right? So right now under reliability, we stopped calculating the old metric. It was not, again, very useful for folks, and we transitioned to that data source. So rather than put in the effort to duplicate that metric on the new data source, we just said, listen, we're working on it. Please be patient. So coming after the board meeting where the board potentially approves the new excess trip time metric, there will be a dashboard in here that measures reliability that you can check and log in and look at every single day. Right now, in lieu of that, we do have the travel times from end to end on each of the subway lines, including the green line in there. So that is what is available as far as reliability. And then for customer satisfaction, we run this survey monthly. So we do have customer satisfaction information. This is available on the website. There's a dashboard that shows what the overall customer satisfaction is. Spoiler alert, it is not good right now. But I think we are all aware of
No
that, right?
surprise.
And
Yeah.
so you can kind of see how that has changed over time. You can select different time periods to take a look at this, going back to 2016 when we debuted this particular data collection effort. Again, monthly customer satisfaction. So you can see kind of the crawl back a little bit from the Snowmageddon from 2015. And then you can also see the similar dip in satisfaction from our recent performance issues in the last couple of years. Those are two places that you can find some of the metrics that you're talking about. There's also ridership. There's some of the speed restrictions data available. And then if you are interested in more information about any of those things, many of the underlying data sources that we've talked about here are available on our open data portal. If you have any questions about the data that you find in there, you can always email us at opmi@mbta.com. And we can help get access to any of that data.
Don't get me wrong, this is great. This was a dream. 18 years ago when I retired, and we were hopefully setting things up so this could happen. And I'm pleased to see how much has happened. But the question is now with all this, what do you do?
What do we do with it? Yes.
How does it
Understood.
affect the service you run every day and making adjustments and modifications in your management practices as well as the schedules and stuff. So what's the next step? Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. So let me just try to wrap this up. We do have one other business thing to talk about on the committee. And I guess I would just, Jen and Laura and Melissa, everyone who's there from the authority, let me just say that I've been out on the road. You might have seen my social media posts for the last couple of months talking to folks, talking to cities and towns and state reps and state senators about the financial challenges. And one of the biggest things I hear is that they don't trust the T, right? I think what you're doing here can be incredibly helpful in helping to move that, because you're being honest. The fact that the authority was reporting 92% on-time performance on the red line when it was clearly not was always problematic. So this is great. You're being honest. And let me just encourage you to continue being honest, continue leveling with the public, continue to be truthful in advertising and what you're doing. And I think that will help. Building back the trust in the MBTA is going to take a long time, but this is a good step in that direction. And I'm grateful to you. And thank you for your presentation. We're going to talk a little bit as a committee about what our next steps are with this. And then we'll be following up.
That sounds great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. So Matt, as Jen mentioned, the advisory board has a statutory requirement to weigh in, I guess, on service delivery policy changes. I mean, this is probably not considered a major change. It's less than 10%, I think. I think that's the metric. So the question for the committee is, what do you want to do with this information? We can certainly take it and issue recommendations to the full board for its December meeting to support it, or we can not do that, or we can just sort of not do anything. By virtue of reporting out to this committee, I'm sort of satisfied that the MBTA has met its requirements to consult with us, but that's more for you folks to decide than for me. And if you tell me to go and talk to the board of directors about it, I'm happy to do that. So that's the question, kind of for you folks on the committee.
Yeah, if I can just weigh in real quick as well. I think the consultations happened. I think it would be good for us to write a letter to describe some of the things that we've heard today. Particularly hearing from Len and Andy, and so myself too, around that bus metric, and maybe there are things of concern that we want to highlight, but also I think there's some things here that are worth praising. So I think saying the T did some really good work, but we think there's still room for improvements, and here are the following areas that we think need some improvement. And it sounds like they're willing and open to work with us going forward, work with municipalities and work with others. But I think just getting that on record, I think would be important. So I'm happy to work with you, Brian, to take a first stab at a letter, and then, we can distribute that to the committee, perhaps.
Great, sounds good. Yeah, why don't you and I connect offline, and we'll get a first draft, which we'll share with folks, and folks can give us their comments. We'll do that through a Google Doc, I guess.
Yeah.
I'll find out what the timeline is, and we can sort of go from there if that works for folks. I see some head
nodding
nods.
heads. Yeah.
So,
If
okay.
I can just add, please try to emphasize how much we appreciate the excess trip time metric, and also what they've done to acquire the data that allows them to do this kind of work. Because as I mentioned earlier, it's great to see that they've brought a lot of that work in-house. We're not relying on consultants, to do the work. That may even require that they hire some people to do that work, but I think it's money well spent, and the data that we've gotten, I think, will allow us to do other things. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, Lynn.
Got it. Cool. Okay, so I guess just watch out for a letter from Matt, probably sent from me, for folks to weigh in on, with a link to a Google Doc and the timeline, and we can go from there if that works for you all. That sounds like it works for everybody. And then just to let everybody know, there's an executive committee meeting, I think Friday, that I'll be mentioning that we had this meeting, but I'm not going to report out on sort of what was talked about or anything, just the fact that it took place. Cool. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Nope. Excellent. Well, I'm sure I'll see some of you tomorrow at the MBTA board meeting, or excuse me, the MPO meeting. And I'll see others of you sooner than that or later than that.
Friday.
So Matt, if you're good, I guess you could ask for a motion to adjourn, and we can go from there.
Thank you, Brian. So yeah, motion to adjourn.
So moved, says Leonard.
Okay.
One. Do we hear a second?
Second.
Excellent.
Aye.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Bye-bye.
Great.
Aye,
Thanks, everyone.
bye-bye.
Thanks,
Have a
folks.
good night. Bye, everyone.